Today, we have a major threat of severe weather across the central US that puts roughly 60 million people at risk. And the main thing with this is going to be damaging winds, hail, and also a strong tornado threat with the potential for a couple of intense tornadoes. Those are going to be in these little outline slash hatched areas. One is going to move up through the spine of central Texas, and another one is going to stretch from parts of northern Missouri through central Illinois, then into northern Indiana. For hail, we could expect hail over 2 inches in diameter, and for wind, we could expect damaging gusts upwards of 70 to 75 miles an hour. So we're going to start with the ingredients behind this setup, and the first one is going to be some very moist air in a very, very large warm sector for all of our storms. We're expecting to see widespread dew points in the mid 60s across both of our risk areas. This is going to be our Texas risk area, moving up to our Midwest risk area. Same thing, dew points are going to be a little bit lower, but we're a bit more north, so that's not really going to be as big of a deal, but still we're seeing the same thing, widespread mid 60s dew points, sometimes in isolated areas, even crawling up into the upper 60s. Now we're going to look at our low pressure system setup. This is going to play a really big role today. And what we're going to notice is that we have this spinning low, which is going to be traversing kind of the Midwestern states and moving northeast. And storms that are going to be closer to this and just this in general is going to provide a lot of really favorable shear for our storms. And now we're going to look at our fronts. We're going to have a cold front draped behind this, which is going to start to push down to the south and is going to probably kind of kick up some storms right here in this Kansas, Oklahoma area as we go into the night hours. And then in front of it, we're actually going to have what is or was a cold front. It's going to start advecting northward and it's going to turn into a warm front. And this is really going to be the key player with our storms today. Anywhere between probably the 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. time frame is when it's really going to be prime time in this main risk area. And this risk area today has the highest ceiling. Now, we have noticed that this warm front has trended a little bit more southward over the last couple of scans, and really that means that it's going to be a little bit harder to get storms initiating south of this warm front and to stay south of this warm front than previously thought. Storms above the warm front or north of it are going to be essentially only primarily hail and wind threats. Most storms south to it or attached to it are going to have that threat of all hazards, including strong tornadoes. As we move down to our Texas risk area, not really seeing any cold or warm fronts, but what we're instead going to see is a little bit of a weak dry line. Now, it looks like this dry line at this point isn't really going to be there that much, and all of the forcing for our storms is going to come in the later hours from a little bit of synoptic forcing or a strong 500 millibar trough. And another thing is that we're going to have some early morning convection in front of this, which is really going to hamper the environment for this, which is going to make that corridor for damaging winds quite a bit smaller. Here's what that trough is going to look like. It's going to start to overspread that area in the afternoon. And because we do have a cap in the region, and it looks like we might not have as clean of a trough ejection as previously thought, these storms probably won't get going until right around the late afternoon and early evening hours. And moving up to the Midwest, there's really a lack of any kinks in our flow. There's really going to be no short waves up here, and is one of the big question marks about this setup. Luckily, it looks like a 700 millibar trough might come in and save the day. We're going to see what looks like a little bit of a short wave impacting here around the mid-afternoon. This would probably fire off storms a little bit too early, only about an hour or two early of when would really be prime time, although that storm would still have the possibility to produce all hazards, including strong tornadoes. But we're going to see a second impulse, and this is also coupled with when we're expecting that low pressure system to kind of kick into the area. And this looks like when we're going to see a little bit more of a favorable environment for upscale growth, which means that these storms wouldn't really be discrete and would turn into a line, which would still kind of have all hazards. So it's damaging winds and hail, except that threat for strong tornadoes is really going to fall off the table at that point. So here's what we're looking at on simulated reflectivity. We're going to have that early morning convection, which is actually going to last pretty much all the way through the day. And this is really going to play a big role in hampering the environment down here in Texas. Now, something to note is that this convection is going to be moving through a pretty unstable environment, upwards of 1500 Cape, upwards of 103 Cape, and it's still going to have around 50 knots of effective organizing shear, which means that we could see some of this cluster and actually produce a severe threat as it moves off into Arkansas. And then, of course, as we move into the very late afternoon, early evening hours, that's when we're going to see that big 500 millibar trough kind of overspread what's a really weak dry line. I think that dry line isn't even going to be play as much anymore, and it's really solely going to be this 500 millibar trough. When it does, that's when we're going to see a lot of storms initiate really quickly. There is a small chance that we could see a couple of prefrontal supercells, which would be poised to actually hold a threat for a strong tornado and also all hazards of severe weather. No guarantees about that, though. That's something that's going to be quite a bit more nowcasting and just monitoring the weather and seeing what it does. But what we are confident of is that a strong QLCS is going to develop, and this is where the possibility for those 70 to 75 mile an hour gusts are going to be possible. This is going to be moving through a pretty favorable environment and will probably last until it kind of crashes into that area where all that morning convection was at probably around 5 hours after sunset. Then it's kind of going to fall apart. And then moving up to the Midwest, we see that there might be a possibility of discrete convection probably in the mid-afternoon. I think this might actually be a little bit too early to really produce those hazards to its greatest capacity. This would be around 21Z or around 2 to 3 p.m. And this would move eastward into Indiana. Still the possibility of producing all hazards. It's just going to miss out on that prime environment. And I wouldn't even rule out a strong tornado in a scenario like this. We're just going to have a little bit of warm advection that gets kicked up by that short wave. And then later in the day, here's going to be our low pressure system. It's going to move up into this area, and coupled with that second impulse and just generally more warm air advection, we're going to get a really messy kind of explosion of convection across central to northern Illinois. This would still hold a tornado threat with those storms south of that warm front or attached to it. It's just because it's going to be more of a clustered look that's really going to hurt the potential for strong tornadoes. Definitely think there could be a scenario where we see something like this. It grows upscale into a damaging cluster of thunderstorms producing somewhat large hail, damaging winds, and even the possibility of quite a few tornadoes. And then this would move off eastward. And then from there, really the last area to look at is going to be down here in parts of Kansas when that cold front kind of starts ripping. When that low pressure system gets here southward, we get to see some convection. Now, these probably won't really get their act together until they move into those greater dew points, which are really only going to be limited to parts of southeastern Kansas. But when they do, there's actually the potential that these could produce some severe weather as well. So that would be damaging winds and hail. And there's even the potential for maybe a tornado if these storms can get into that greater environment. There still would be some shear left there. It's just that threat of a tornado is not going to be nearly as large as our areas up in the Midwest and then down in Texas. And then this is weather sounding with our environment down in Texas. We're going to notice a couple of things immediately. One is going to be how much instability we have. This sounding from the NAM is showing upwards of 3,400 Cape and upwards of 125.3 Cape. That's a very unstable environment, which is immediately going to just be very favorable for severe weather. And then couple that with 67 dew points, 73 over 67, with a little bit of capping inversion, which I think will be easily overcome by that 500 millibar trough moving through, and then just how much instability there is up here in this elevated mix layer. And these lapse rates are not going to be perfect, but they're definitely not going to be bad by any means, anywhere between 8 Celsius to 7 Celsius decreasing per kilometer all the way up. That's going to be very favorable for hail, as well as the turning of our winds with height, and then just fairly decent shear in the low levels what we're looking for a tornado threat is 150 SRH coupled with 20 knots of low level shear. We're definitely seeing above that. And then these effective shear numbers for kind of the maintenance of this line are just going to be so insanely good, over 70 knots. So what this is going to bring, this is absolutely going to bring the threat for some pretty large hail in the earlier stages of this, even when it turns into a greater line. I would not be surprised to see some embedded supercells still producing around an inch and a quarter sized hail. I definitely think damaging winds are going to be a pretty solid concern with this. This is a very favorable thermodynamic profile with a decent bit of dry air aloft, then even our photograph very straight and a nice little curvature in the lower levels. I think spin up tornadoes across this line are going to be expected. And then this is the sounding from the area that could go big or could go not so big up in the Midwest. And immediately, seeing a couple of things, still very unstable environment. We're seeing probably around 2000. We have 2500 mixed layer cape. That is a bunch up here. This is going to be very favorable for hail production, as well as how strong our effective shear is going to be, 55 knots, as well as our winds turning with height. That's going to be very favorable for some large hail. I think this area might produce up to 2.5 inch in diameter hail. I think that's going to be very possible for damaging winds. We have a downdraft cape of 1200, a mid relative humidity of around 50%, and then also quite a bit of dry air aloft. That's going to be pretty favorable for that damaging wind threat as well. I would not be surprised to see damaging winds potentially upwards of 75 miles an hour up here later if we do get that solution where we get a line cranking through here in the later hours. Now for our low level shear, also going to be kind of insane. We have about 400 SRH and 44 knots of low level shear in our effective inflow region. This is definitely going to be enough if we do see an environment like this and we do see discrete supercells for strong tornadoes. This curvature in the low levels is really solid, and then we see a very nice elongation out on our photograph. And then to top it off, our 3 cape is probably going to be around 100 for this whole thing. So this area definitely does have the highest ceiling and the best ingredients to produce strong tornadoes, and even just generally all hazards of severe weather. In my opinion, it's just, will kind of the stars align for our storms getting forced up at the correct times, or will they kind of succumb to a messy initiation and cluster together, and we won't really see this area come to a full fruition? The last thing to note is that our supercell composite is going to be around 27, and our significant tornado parameter is going to be anywhere between 4 to 8 in this region at that time. Really solid numbers, and definitely just a high ceiling for severe weather, but also a pretty modest floor up in the Midwest.